computer? Excellent. All right, so my goal for today is to just start talking and sharing and problem solving with you guys about, hey Ingrid, about what process I use for applying the notans that I make, right? And sometimes people ask like, oh, do you always make a notan? No, I don't always make a notan. I'm a bad boy. But in my mind, I am making notans, and I have a lot of practice making notans, so I don't always make them now. And I don't always draw on my paper anymore. But if I'm doing demos and things, then I draw on my paper, right? It's a communication tool. And then if I do a painting and I'm not satisfied with it and I've sat with it for a little while and I want to try it again, sometimes I will do a notan then. Yes, right? Because it's a way to educate myself about the subject. So, we all have levels and problems we're solving, and we're at different stages of growth. And so, I think making a notan is hyper valuable, but I don't do it every single time. That's the short of it. Once I have, right, so, and of course, right, the notan is funneling down all these values and we're making all these choices. And for those of you who are able to participate in the 30-day challenge, right, in October, so then you have some practice making a notan and what you can learn from a notan, right? How it can help you simplify your values, find contrasts, assess composition, right? What are the big shapes? Where are the leading lines? Oh, look at this is framing this, or it's too busy here and I need it to be balanced. So I need a quiet space and an active space. And these sorts of things can become really clear when we're doing notans, right? Because we simplify the contrasts down so far. And somebody had asked on the blog, like, well, why not just do value sketches? And value sketches are great, just to say. So I got nothing against value sketches. But I find that value sketches are often, as I said I responded on the comment, but I think value sketches are often a rendering of the reference photo, right? And if you're often doing it with a pencil, and it doesn't always simplify it. So what I really feel like it does is it helps you get acquainted with the subject, understand perspective, all the kinds of things that are going on in the subject. But I don't think it particularly helps you simplify the subject. And I actually find for a lot of painters, once you get past the stage where you're not able to control anything and it's just like madness on your paper, once you get past that stage, I actually find that students I have, the real problem is that everything is a rendering and they just can't escape from all the detail in their subject. And because you have some control and you've worked so hard to gain control. And in the beginning, you really had to work at control, because if you didn't work at control, it would just be bonkers. So I actually find there's a process of sort of unlearning that. And there's a process of simplifying the images, right? And choosing your details. And the notan can become really valuable for that. And that's why, and I think it can help us when we go to paint also, because it has already helped us in those mental elements of the game. So I actually think it's often not about technique, is not necessarily the problem. Of course, technique can get better, but it's really about the mental part of it, like how I'm arranging my shapes and how I'm leading the eye through this, the painting. And then what am I going to remove and to give myself sort of the permission to alter what was there, right? To make it either better or at least more reflective of yourself. So that's why I use a notan. And that's why I like to teach them. I think they push people a little farther than just what a sketch does. I think a sketch is really powerful, but I don't think it does everything. Um, so Sonia was asking, can I discuss the relationship between notans and composition? So from my perspective, composition is a mental game, and um, it's a lot about contrast and arranging contrast in the picture plane. So of course, notans are really good at arranging and helping you see value contrast, right? I'm doing them in black and white. Value contrast is super strong. But in addition to that, um, it, it everything has to have an edge. And so what begins to become apparent is you'll have leading lines in spaces that you're not really thinking of. Maybe it's the curb of a road leading in, or it's a line of a tree coming down into a trunk, right? Or it's a mountain that's dark enough that it's not too far away, and it has a diagonal line that's leading you in, and another one's leading you in over here. And I find when people are doing notans, these kind of compositional elements become more obvious, right? And sometimes we think, oh, this is like, look, it's going to be doing it. And I can see, these lines or whatever. But when you go to do a notan, sometimes by pushing the contrasts, it makes you decide and recognize things like, oh, well, yes, but those mountains are actually really far away and really pale. And they're not going to be a very strong line, for the sake of an example, right? So sometimes I find by sort of distilling the contrasts down and heightening them, we can see the relationships a little bit better. And then we can do things like, oh, look, this area is super busy and it needs to be calm because it's competing with this primary area of interest. And by wiping it out, so to speak, and making it dark or making it less full of contrast and less active, then we all know where to guide the eye, right? And I do find when we're doing a sketch, right, we really I get sucked into the details of the sketch. It gets harder and harder to really simplify it. And so some painters I've seen, they don't call it a notan, but it's a notan, really, is what it is. They learned it as a sketch. But I don't know, for example, like there's a Bay Area artist, he's an oil painter, Paul Kratter, Kratter. So Paul Kratter is an oil painter, as an example, and he's active on Facebook and social media. What was that? Oh, somebody, let me see if I remember. There's a way to do it, folks. Somehow I mute you, but the other person stopped. It's all good. So Paul Kratter does these little sketches with a pen and ink ahead of time, and they're quite small. Maybe they're only 2x2 or so. And he's like doing cross hatching for them, but they're very simplified shapes, right? And he's really kind of almost doing the outlines of shapes and then sort of filling them in with cross hatching of different values. And so they're not interested in all of the details of the scene. They're interested in the arrangements of big shapes and how they guide the eye through the painting. So like somebody like Paul Kratter, if you look him up, like those are interesting alternative examples where he's also using it as a compositional tool, and it isn't about fine detail, right? But he is really simplifying it, and he's not doing it with pen and ink, like a Pentel brush pen. He's, using a ballpoint pen. So he breaks all the rules, but he's really, really good. So it doesn't matter. This is the short of it. All right. Did anybody else have any other quick questions about sort of why are we using a notan and the introductory basics? As I said in the description, my goal today is to kind of not have this be a, hey, I'm going to make a notan demo, because I've done those and those are available or you've been doing them. So I wanted to talk today mostly about what do I do after I've done a notan and how can it aid me in the painting process. So let me switch over the camera. And we're going to go top down. All right, and that's a little bit bright. Just a moment. I want to see how this looks in Zoom. It's a little bit bright. Let's it's a little bit better. Um, good enough. Good enough for government work. Okay, so this is the subject that we're working on today, or I'm going to be working on, and you can work on if you desire to do so. The reference photo is on the blog post for those who aren't participating in the From Photo to Final Painting Facebook group. So you can download it there if you're interested in putting it up on a screen or you want to see it in greater detail. I understand this isn't super high res, but it gets the job done. So this is the Notan that I did that was a 3-value Notan, right? It's entering the realm of a rendering, right? It's got more detail. But this is actually just as functional. It's definitely more abstract, but it's still functional. So sometimes when I see other people bring in their content for a Notan, one of the real problems is that their reference photos aren't strong enough in contrast. So, right, we have a leg up in something like this, and I choose subjects like this because right from the beginning, I know that the contrast is strong. So it's going to communicate shapes with greater ease. Now this is, got many little shapes and it's complex, but we have a dark value and we clearly have a pale value. And sometimes when folks are trying to make a Notan and then apply it, part of the problem is that actually the reference photo always had problems from the beginning because there wasn't a strong enough value relationship between their lights and their darks, right? And of course, you can make paintings that don't have a super strong value structure. They just get harder to do really well, right? And you have to become more sophisticated as a painter if you're going to do them. So of course, when I'm like trying to help folks learn how to apply it, I'm trying to find content that's going to make the job easier for you rather than making it already hard. So I know, like, we're all like, well, why can't I be like, Turner or something, And I'm like, well, there's a whole host of reasons why we don't paint like Turner. And right, but Turner's able to get away with stuff that other folks haven't learned enough yet to be able to do. So yes, we have this here, and I want to get back in a little piece of paper. Okay. So I'm often talking with folks about the hourglass idea. And I know if you've taken a class with me, then I've talked with you about it before, right? And the idea is that in the beginning, we're putting our little reference photo and it all goes in and we're crunching down all the values just to 2 values. There's all these values in the subject. And of course, this reference photo has got at least, I don't know, it's got an infinite number of values, but it's got at least 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 values, right? Like it is, we've got sections that are white, and then we got sections that are like off-white, right? We got sections that are sort of a middle value, and we got sections that are really dark, just as a most basic concept of, deconstructing the value range. And when we crush it down to a Notan, we're like, no. Contextually, this middle value is way darker than what's next to it, right? So I make it a black in the Notan, it disappears. Here it is there, here it is kind of coming around the edge there. Because that value is important, and they're so different here that even though this middle value is clearly paler than this really dark value, they're both black in the Notan. And So, right, so we're crushing the values down when we make the notan. I'm going over this because we have to go through the other half of the hourglass. So, of course, what happens on the other side? It opens back up. Maybe down here we have 4 or 5 or an infinite number of values. And I say this because when we go to approach the painting process, we need to be thinking like, oh, well, you know, I have to have a plan. And when I go in to start painting, folks are always starting paintings and they don't have an idea of how they're actually going to paint it. They're just kind of like, God, I really want to get going, right? And then they jump in and, you know, sadness occurs. So, so understanding how we're going how I crush these values down can help me understand how I'm going to open them back up, right? And the notan can guide us. So in this example, I'm going to come in first and I'm going to paint all my pale values first, just like normal, right? And I am going to, if there are sections in the whites of my notan that are actually white in my photo, and I want them to be the paper, then of course, I'm going to preserve those. And what goes around them for the first wash, however, I mean, it's not going to be white, right? It's going to have some sort of value to it. That is also the whites of my notan, right? Because the notan, when I crushed it down and brought it into the hourglass, there were multiple values. I was like, well, these are really the palest values. They're bonded together visually when I look at the painting or the reference photo, you know, quickly. So I'm going to paint them. I'm going to preserve my whites, and I'm going to drop in my basically my palest values, right? Then it dries, and I come back on top, and I'm going to do my darker values. But the thing that can be really interesting about how a notan can help you with this process also is that we know when we look at the reference photo, there's all kinds of values inside of the blacks, right? Not just black. It's like totally black, quite dark, almost black, really kind of a middle value, and then like, it's a middle value, but it's darker than the whites, right? So inside of the blacks, I can begin to paint wet into wet, and I can let those values softly separate from each other, right? Like the edges don't have to be hard everywhere. The edges can bond together, and I can use the values wet into wet to create the shapes that I want to create inside of the blacks. So one of the things that the notan can really help us do is the notan, of course, is bonding objects together and turning them into shapes, right? And so objects into shapes. Thank you. Where was I? I just want to make sure you guys were a little bit quiet, and I wanted to make sure that I could hear you. And I think I can is the short answer. Just a moment. And come on, open up. Somewhere in here, you are not quite as noisy as I want you to be. And I'm wondering if it's a setting. Right? So just a moment. Okay. I think it's good for the moment. Somebody I think's chatting on their phone is what I'm hearing. So when we make the notan, we bond values together, right? We take different objects, this stone, that stone, in this example, and we bond them together into one much larger, more sophisticated shape.
Sorry, the person talking on the phone is really messing with the audio.
Yes, let me see if I can. Once upon a time, I haven't done a demo in a while, so I'm looking for the magic button where I'm looking for the magic button, folks. Give me a sec. That one goes in. Right. Sorry, folks. Give me a minute. Sounds like somebody French.
You can
Et
make
puis
a
du...
mute themselves.
Ouais, moi ça va. Et
They
qu'est-ce que
could,
du coup
but
t'as
I don't think they know that they're
t'as quelque
being.
chose ou intéressant. Ah non, je
I
suis
don't
bête,
think they
je sais pas
know
non
that
plus,
they're
excuse-moi.
Oh,
Ah non,
sorry.
excuse-moi, chérie.
Hold on. Let's fix this.
Mhm.
Thus, the nature of Zoom.
Mhm.
Sorry, just a moment.
Mhm.
Gallery.
C'est un égyptologue, non? C'est Vivien dedans? Ou c'est...
And
Non? Mhm. Mhm.
victory. I think it's victory. All right, back to the demo. All good, no problem. So what I wanted to say is that when we're making a notan, we are already bonding shapes together, right? We're bonding objects together and we're turning them into shapes, right? This, of course, this crazy black shape doesn't really look like all of these rocks, right? We know they're all bonded together. So if we want to simplify our paintings, and if we would like to have more soft edges, and if we're interested in sort of altering the experience from the photo and to turn it into something new, the Notan can guide us into where we do our wet into wet shapes, right? Also, when we do our whites, if we want to, we can have more wet into wet work for the whites, right? Now, of course, I understand that this is like it's not a science. It's an art, so it varies a bit in terms of how you want to apply it. So I'll just say, the more contrasts that you want to save, the more complex, of course, the image gets. What do I mean by this? If I make a notan like this and I think, yeah, I see the big shapes now, but you know what? These rocks in here are actually kind of important to me. And I really want to have all the rocks be separated from each other. Well, then you're going to have to paint more stages to control your edges because you're choosing to maintain more contrasts. Not only are you going to maintain value contrast, but you also want to maintain edge contrast. And you want to tell, as I say, you want to tell the story of the scene more explicitly. So the more contrasts that you want to keep and you want to kind of enunciate in the painting, yes, the more stages you do, more and more and more and more and more, right? The more you want to simplify things and you want to bond your shapes together. And when you look at paintings by, I don't know, Andy Evenson or Joseph Zbukvich or Alvaro Castanet or Sargent, right? Let's pick somebody older. Like, what is part of what makes their subjects interesting? Yes, of course. They have all these bonded, the objects bond together to make compelling shapes. They're exiting the realm of control. And it doesn't have to tell me everything. It allows me a way into the story. So that's what I'm going to do today for part of this, to kind of explore what it's like to take the Notan and not have to tell you everything, right? The Notan is helping me simplify it, and it's helping me do my wet into wet work. And it's helping communicate to me what edges are important, these white versus dark edges, and what edges I can release a little bit. I'm going to paint them wet into wet. So let's take what I have for today is this little sheet, right? So I have this is one of my 8x8 sheets that I like to use. And I picked this because I don't want to actually do the whole painting. I can't do it. I can't honestly do it properly in the time of the demo in the way that I'd like to. So I'm just going to do a piece of the painting, right? And as I go through it, I'm hoping that out of this will come some conversation that's of value about how we're using the Notan, how I'm using the Notan, and how you can try and use your Notans. So I'm going to do some quick sketching. and just to kind of show you about the level of sketching that I'm going to do for this, and then we're going to jump in. When I'm doing a sketch, I'm going to do the upper left hand. Well, you'll see what it looks like here in a moment. When I'm doing a sketch, I'm really blocking in important shapes. That's my goal. This is one of the big rocks that is in the water. And here's this little sliver next to it. Right? Right? Not super detailed. I'm just blocking in the shape. Here we have the rocks over on the left-hand side of the screen. Here we have a very strong shadow. And once I leave my hand, you can see it a little better. And then what I'm going to do here, and it's almost like I am, I'm really blocking out the shapes of the edges of the Notan. I don't know if you've noticed this yet, right? I'm blocking out what would be the dark edges of my shadows. This comes over. So I'm not going to do the whole thing. Comes over more. That goes up. There's a whole bunch of stuff over here in the reference photo. And here in the water is a interestingly shaped rock. And over here, the water is curving around this rock. So it's like you can tell it's a submerged rock. Here's a bright valued stone, right? So we have it's like the left-hand side of the painting and a little bit more in the middle. And then over here is this looks like almost like a fin of a white rock in the dark water. So something like this is adequate for me for a sketch, particularly if I've already done the Notan, because I've already got the values in my mind, right? And boop, there we go, a little bit more in focus. I've already got the values in my mind, and I don't need to do all the little details. In fact, I don't want to do all the details, right? Why? Because we're not painting with our pencil, we're painting with the brush. And when we paint with the pencil, the subject can come out, as I would say, the subject comes out accurately, but kind of dead, right? I'm sure you guys have also had that sad experience of spending a lot of time on a painting. You think, yeah, it actually has all the parts that are in the photo, they're in the painting, yet for some reason, it doesn't have any allure to it, right? So somehow including everything doesn't actually make it a better photo. I mean, a better painting, right? So we want to choose what's interesting. I am going to wet the back. And if you've not seen me do this, it's not rocket science, but it is a super valuable tool. I learned this from somebody else, right? And I just found that wetting the back of the paper, particularly for studio work where I have time, has allowed me to take my time with certain elements, and I don't have to worry about everything drying out so quickly. So the wet is back. The wet is back. The back is wet. I wet the paper. I put some extra water on my gator board, my hard right surface, and I like this, it's a mister for your kitchen, right? I think they use it for oil. I use this for painting. From like a foot and a half away, I'm gonna gently mist this because it helps regulate the temperature, the moisture level on the top. And so, right, when it's wet on the bottom, it starts to push out the sides as the bottom of the paper expands. And when I put a tiny bit of water on top, it helps basically the top gently expand as well so that it'll lay flat. But it's not so wet that it's going to stop me from getting a hard edge. So this is soaking in. So the first thing that the Notan does for me is it helps me simplify. You can come through, Sugar. They can't see anything. Okay. So it helps you simplify the sketch, right? I don't have to include all the details. I'm only really including the edges of my shapes. It allows me to sort of geolocate them proportionately with each other, and that's adequate. Then everything else I'm going to do inside these shapes to kind of communicate the different objects. So if I'm going back to the photo, so I'm going to assume some of you have the photo up somewhere, and then I'm going to assume some of you have forgotten or you're not capable of doing that right now. So as I was saying before, when we simplified our values down, our whites have a white, actually white, and then it has a very pale value, right? And this is the opportunity to drop those in. So over here, some of the stones are cool. Over here, the stones are warmer, right? I'll play a little bit with the temperature of my wash, and I'm gonna play a little bit with keeping some of the edges of these so I can keep my whites, right? So I'm gonna open up, I'm gonna go through the hourglass, I'm gonna open up my whites. And when I do this, if my value contrast is strong enough, and this value contrast is strong enough, I don't paint what I call geographically. I kind of paint globally with glazes. So if I paint geographically, it means I have to I paint this shape and this little shape and that little shape. And then you're trying to make your edges like perfectly meet. That's really difficult to do. When I paint globally, it means I just do a wash over everything, right? And of course, I'm keeping my whites separated. Later, when I come in to do my darks, I can paint my darks positively. I don't have to kiss the edge of my light shapes. So I'm not going to somehow come through here and fret over putting a little bit of color under the green of the water. Why? Because the green of the water is dark enough that it won't matter, right? Watercolors doesn't really get enough credit for being opaque, and it is. It's pretty opaque. So let's get cracking. We've already been here for a half an hour. Get going, Steve. All right. Warm and cool. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And I'm just pushing back and forth between these two for my pale values. So I have a little section on my palette where I like to have my muted hues be cool. And I like to have a section on the palette where my hues are warm, this side. Then I have a section out here for like greens and opaque and special pigments. That tends to be how I arrange my palette. I also like to keep 1 cup is dirty water and 1 cup is clean water, because sometimes I actually want to like kiss the edge of a shape and I want to have control over where I have a soft edge and where I have a clean edge, and having clean water can really help me do a lot of that kind of work. All right. So up in here, it is, yeah, that's good. It's a muted blue. And there are little X sections of white. And there are areas we're going to come to them in a minute here, where the rock transitions from a very pale value into a dark value, but I'm not thinking of it as like, what am I going to do and how am I going to paint this rock? It's divided in two. I'm just painting the values, right? So the Notan tells me, focus on my lights, right? And over here, it's very bright. And then I'm going to, here it's like a piece of the rock that's in shadow. Here, this side of this rock, this like fin in the water is quite bright, surrounded by water. And then in here, we transition. In here, there is stone. This is the dark area. It's going to become the dark area. And here we have these like diagonal pieces coming into the water. And all I'm looking at is what in this area is white and what in this area is pale, but not as pale as the totally white section, right? And then this is going to come in. And then as I come around this area over here, the stones are a little warmer. So they're a little bit of a brown. And I can definitely see over here, we have little crags and crevices in the stone. And they are very bright and they have nice, interesting edges. So, right, I'm just kind of indicating some of these edges so that it looks a little bit like stone. I'm going to grab a little bit more of the blue. And then this stone up here is very bright, just has a little bit of an edge here. And then like I said, I'm not going to just paint the whites. I'm starting out by sort of painting in the whites, but I'm actually going to come in now and I'm just going to allow myself to come through here. What this is going to let me do is it's going to let me have kind of control of my edges. I don't have to have this perfect edge around my stone. I can just do kind of a big global wash. And it goes over the whole thing. In here, there's a little bit on this big, I'm going to call it a fin that sticks out of the water. And there's a little bit here. And there's a little bit on top. Then the rest of this, right, is going to go in the water. This is an area where, you know, in the future, it'll be a dark value. But for the moment, I'm just, here is also a pale value. This is on top of a little rock at the bottom. So it's a funny sort of thing I'm doing, which is in this area where like I have a very pale rock and it comes up to the water. And I know in the future, the water is going to be a dark. I'm actually kind of painting around my lights. I'm preserving my whites. And then I'm actually dropping in a pale wash everywhere. And what's going to come out of this experience is that I'm going to have all of the things in the photo, all of the things in my Notan that are a white are here, right? They're going to either be a white or they're going to be a very pale value. And I don't have to worry about any of my edges, you know, like this dark edge is a stone and this dark edge here is some part of the water, but it doesn't matter. They can just flow together and I don't have to worry about separating them because later when I put my darks on top, that's when I'll cut my edge. So this is some sort of rugged stone on the edge here. I put a little bit of blue up top, and it comes in like that. And then if I look at the reference photo, and if I look at my Notan, there's little bits of light refracting off of the water, right? These little sparkles. So I'm going to save some of those now by painting them negatively. I'm using the side of the brush to get little bits of dry brush work. And then I just kind of clean it up, right? So I get a little dry brush work like that. And using the side of the belly of the brush when I'm doing that. And then I have interesting marks and I can come in and kind of tidy them up. Okay. So at this stage, this, as I see it, is the first stage for this painting. What I've done is anywhere that I had a white in the Notan, I've painted it. And I'm opening it back up. So it's gone through the hourglass. So when it goes through the hourglass on the other side, it's either all white, just like it is in the Notan, or it's a super pale value, but it has some kind of interesting texture to it, right? It's part of the story of the painting. It's part of the story of the subject. We want to include it so we understand it's a rock. So that's what's going in now. And then I just include it all the way across. So I understand all this area in here is going to become the water, right? There's a big area that I've washed over. It doesn't matter for now because I'm going to cut my edges later when I come in and do my darks on top of this. So, and by the way, so I wet the bottom, right? And it'll be wet for a long, long time. It's so wet, it doesn't even fall off the paper, right? Off the backing. It just sticks to it with water tension. So if I was painting just for myself at home, I could let this sit here for an hour or an hour and a half, and it would still be moist. It would just very slowly dry. But for today, of course, we don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I am going to mute myself and I'm going to blow dry it, just the surface. Then I'm going to come back in and we're going to put our darks on top of it, and we're going to let the Notan guide us for how we're going to approach it. So just a moment, and I'm going to mute myself and I'll be back. All right. So we're on to round 2. So at this stage, the back of the paper is still wet, right? If I pick it up, it still stays attached just through water tension. I dried the surface. It is, if I use the back, it's dry, but it's like a tiny bit cool to the touch. And I don't know if you can tell, but like this is, that's A-okay, Sonia, it'll be recorded for you. This is gently peeling up, right? It's not quite as dry as the sides are, not quite as wet as the sides are. Now, let me drop that in for us. A little bit down. There we go. So if I wet the back a little bit more, then I can make the, adhere again. So for something like this, I can come in, I can gently lift it, wet the back a little bit with my spritzer, wet the backing a little bit, and I can drop it back down. I can hold it in place, kind of revive the back of it so that it has a little bit longer to stay attached. So at this stage, to me, this is the easy phase, right? Most of it's hard to kind of go wrong. I'm doing all these little light washes everywhere. I'm going to see if I can tilt this so you can see. There we go. The value is just a little tiny bit better. And a lot of the work is going to come in the second round. But what this phase does do is drops of value in everywhere, helps me keep whatever I want to have remain white is going to stay white for the rest of it, right? And as I progress through the painting, mostly I'm going to be working in smaller and smaller and smaller areas, right? I do my lights, I'm going to put my darks on top of it, and then I'll put my darkest darks on top of that, and I'll scratch out or add highlights at the end. So it's usually like pale, dark, darkest, and then at the end, don't worry, I'm going to reclaim some little highlights if I want to reclaim them. That's the way it functions. And there we go. So, right, this is this. Well, it's like that. Is this. Yep. There's the fin. That's this. This big guy here is this, right? And all this wash underneath, it doesn't matter. If I was trying to have two shapes go next to each other and they're the same value, but they're different hues, like this was pink and that was green, oh, I can't do this, right? So the more that we want to maintain contrasts, the harder it gets. The more that we have strong contrasts, like a dark value and a light value, things of that nature, then the easier it is for us to stack our shapes. We can put our pale wash on first, we can let the Notan guide us, and then we can come in and do our dark values on top of that. So before I jump into doing my greens and doing the dark values on top of this, does anybody have any questions so far about what I'm trying to do? I'll take that as a hearty no. You guys
I
are
just
all...
have a technical question.
Yeah.
Is anyone else finding their screen is freezing?
Mine's not. I don't know if anybody else's is.
No.
I think it's my Wi-Fi. That's okay. Thank you.
No.
So I'm starting off by mixing up a green. Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm looking at the greens in the photo, right? And they're not super duper duper vibrant. So I'm mixing a yellow, cad yellow with a little bit of like ultramarine blue, a little bit of burnt sienna to mute it, right? And just like when we were doing the whites of the Notan, I know the darks are in here, and right? And I know that I can get darker and darker and darker inside of my dark shape. So I can start with sort of a middle value, and I can get it to be darker, and I can drop more darks into it. I can lift out of it if I want to, right? It's a back and a forth. Because the paper's wet underneath, I have time. right? That's one of the important elements of the conversation, is that there's time. Okay. So the other thing to say is I know that there are like there's also darks on the stone. I wanted to say this. So, right, all these little slivers in here, those are darks in my Notan, because contextually they're much darker than what's next to them, right? So I'm actually going to paint these top left going across into the water. I'm going to paint these little dark sections. Yes? No, I just heard a sound. I'm going to paint these dark areas and move down through the painting. And they're going to be a dark, kind of as a dark gray, right? Or like there's a shadow here. That's also a dark in the Notan, right? Because contextually, locally, it's much, much darker than what's around it. And I need the edge to be hard. I need a hard edge to communicate its shape. So it's also going to go in this phase. So the Notan is helping me figure out, okay, this goes in first. Now I'm going to drop my darker values in. So I have this brush for my greens. I'm going to grab nice pointy synthetic. And I'm going to take my ultramarine blue and my burnt sienna, and I'm going to mix up kind of a gray, right? When I come down from over here, here's the water's edge, right? There's not going to fret. One, I'm doing a demo, but two, I'm not going to fret over every detail because they're not all important to me. I'm really interested in the experience of making the painting and simplifying the painting. So these are the little, the little edges of the stone as they go down towards the water. There we go.
Il n'y a pas de truc là, lui, il est un... T'as compris? Hein?
All right. How did we do this before?
Il a les mêmes que moi, le père là.
And here, as an example, is a cast shadow. Right, goes like this. This is actually a cast shadow of a rock on a rock. And then I can see there's like a little section where we have a piece of the rock that is visible. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close to this, what's going on in the photo. Here's that curve. So this can always get darker and darker and darker inside of this, the black of the Notan, right? Inside of my darks, it can always get a little bit darker. Okay, here's a fun little sliver of light there. Okay, I'm just trying to get, I'm trying to get this to come down to the water's edge, right? Because once I come to the water's edge, I can start to, I'm going to change my hue, but the value is still going to be a dark value, right? Here's this cast shadow over here. The little line that comes across, it's like a broken, like granite. So it has little cracks and fissures in it. And, okay. Here's the water's edge. And you can see in some spots, the green is kind of, it's a little, I don't know, yellowy, browny. And it goes around this stone. And I can see that it's a little bit warm. So I'm grabbing some burnt sienna. It's warm on the stone. So inside of this shape, right, I'm moving around the color wheel. I'm definitely moving around different hues. And as I move along, I'm going to be moving through different values inside of the dark shape also, right? It starts off kind of in the middle. And going to get darker and darker as we go. All right. Here, it should be a little, I'm looking at the reference photo. I need some burnt sienna. Something like that. And here's where that big stone comes down to meet the water. So are you guys starting to be able to see what part of the reference photo I'm painting? Like, is it starting to appear a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to. It's live.
Appreciate it. All right. Here's this. Right.
I will get my ear pods, whatever they're called.
Yep. Good enough for me. So you can already start to see some of the shape takes place, right? The real problem is that right now the shape is flat. It looks like the Notan actually. Just not as dark, but it's the same basic shapes. Let me see if I can do it. There we go. Right? It won't fit all the way on the camera, but you guys get the idea of what I'm doing here.
Thank you. If you could put it up there, that would be great.
I can get it up there, but it won't be the whole Notan on screen, right? It'll only be a portion of it. Let me see if I can put this here.
Above your paint tray.
What did you say?
Yeah,
Not me, somebody else. Okay.
no, it was me.
Okay. I'm going to take my little head. I'm going to move it over on top of the water. Whoop. Because now we'll be able to see a little bit more of the reference photo and the painting. So,
Terrific.
right, it goes up past it, but it gives you at least a concept of what I'm working on. Over here, the dark values are actually a middle value. They're these little sections that are in the water. So I'm going to take my burnt sienna, make it very pale, and drop it into this little area over here. And the darks of the Notan are quite complex if we pay attention. Like here, there's a dark cast shadow from the fin. But in the Notan, they're all dark, right? Because this part where the stone is underwater is still contextually much darker than what's around it. So I'm going to paint that shadow eventually, but I'm just going to paint it wet into wet inside this shape that the Notan is showing me, right? So this is where the Notan for me can be really valuable because it can help you figure out how you want to simplify your shapes and it can help you get a little bit more. You could take more chances with your wet into wet work, which I find is often quite difficult for folks when they're new to doing it wet into wet. You're scared of losing your shapes, but the truth is that the Notan is showing you how much, you've already done a lot of the heavy lifting by doing the Notan in terms of like simplifying your shapes and believing that it's going to end up looking like what you want it to look like. You've done the Notan and you already simplified your shapes and it looked correct. So what's really lovely about painting about wetting the back of the paper when we're doing something like this is that like this over here is still wet. It doesn't dry. Takes a long.
That's amazing. And that is just from you wetting the back of the paper
Yes.
originally.
The cost
even though
of
you dried
admission, right?
most?
Like it's worth it just for I understand. That's how I felt when I learned it. So I'm always gently
Wow.
pushing it is the short of it. Because it's like, oh my God, it changed. Like if you could only hear my wife, Kat, did it change the way I painted? Yes. She's told me that multiple times. So it has.
That's nuts. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, it's totally nuts and super valuable. It's very, very valuable. Yes. Because what it really helps you do is it allows you to paint subjects more easily anyways that have complex edges, right? And you can get away from like being trapped by your subject matter where you feel like, boy, I wish I could paint that, but how am I going to paint it wet into wet, right? I'm just going to have, it's all going to be little sharp, inicky finicky edges, and it's not very attractive, right? So, but when we get to have it this way, then I can really allow myself the time to connect shapes, and I can get much more sophisticated shapes, right? And I think, sophisticated shapes are part of what makes a painting really interesting because we're bonding the shapes together, right? We're turning objects we're putting objects inside of a big painting stew. And when we come out, we really have shapes, not objects anymore. Or it's some sort of back and forth in terms of, you still want to tell the story. That would be objects. I know it's a rock or a river, but also shapes, right? Like that's the abstract part that's interesting, that it's gone through a little stew. Here I'm using the side of the brush, right? I'm not painting like this, using the side of the brush. And I'm still doing, these are what I'm calling the middle values. There we go. Of the darks. These are the palest parts of the darks. But already, right? Already, for sure, this and this are very related.
Okay.
So let me see just a moment.
What did I just do?
Okay. I just was checking in because a couple folks had, I was checking in to see if people had questions in the chat. And so there were a few more. There were a few chat, people had dropped a couple questions in. So here's the water. Here's this area, that's the stones, but they're all the darks. But I haven't finished yet. I'm going to add in these darks in the stones. And they're going to bond to the, I will post my palette colors. They're actually, I'll share a link to the post I've done in the past over what colors I use, right? So I have a blog post and I share that kind of information in it. So in here, I'm mixing up ultramarine blue again. I'm going back into the stone. And so like over here, right? This is still, it's a little drier, but it's still wet. I'm actually going to come in here. I'm going to take this from like 2 feet away. And I'm just doing a very, very light dusting to get a little bit of water into this. Here is a section where the stone is in shadow, and so is the water. So we have like a little lost edge. And I'm trying to communicate just a tiny bit the transition in material through the change in hue, right? Here's this like little seam. This is like a cast shadow way over here. And I don't worry too much that, hey, this has lost an edge. That's okay. Here's that. And there's like a little seam here. It's something like this. Here's that up there. There's a little seam up there too. And none of these, in my opinion, none of these are particularly dark. They're just darker than what's next to them, right? That's the idea of local contrast. It's not like, hooey, I'm dropping in blacks everywhere. But when I think about the shapes of the compositional shapes in a painting, right? All these little middle values, they're going to be closer to the darks than they are to the lights. So they really do separate. They help me see the shape of things. And here is this interesting shape. This is part of the stone, and the stone is casting a little shadow on the top of itself, onto itself. I'm going to take this like that. Here, this is also in shadow. Actually, it's entirely in shadow. There we go. Over here, there's a little cast shadow where the stone drops things onto itself. There we go, casts its shadow. Here, there's that. There's a little cast shadow here. Actually, I've already done it. I can't really see it. There we go. Now that little stone has like a peak. And okay. So we're nearing, this is like the ending of the beginning of the darks. So what I've done is I'm just dropping in all of these values, all of these hues, and they're all middle values, right? They're not particularly dark. And squeezing out my sponge. So at this phase, I think, if I look at this up here versus what I've dropped in so far, we can see how, yes, this is much paler than that, but they're the same basic shapes, right? I have all the ones I did in the first wash were the whites. I opened them up. I have white, and I have a little bit something darker than white. Right now I'm doing the darks, and the darks these are the palest values of the darks. And I'm going to drop wet into wet, darker and darker values. And at the end, if I want to put a white on top, or I want to scratch something out, or whatever it might be, then I'll find little highlights that I want to use or create at the end. And if I decide, hey, this shadow that's really dark, maybe it's important to me that it have a dark edge, then I let this dry and I drop my darkest darks on top of it. So I have preserving my whites, having my like a number 2, my pale whites, but they have some sort of value to them. And then I'm done with my whites. Then I can drop in my middle values, which are the beginnings of my darks. That's what I just did. And now wet into wet, I can do other darks inside of here. And if I really want to have a hard edge for a dark, I can do that at the end, right? And then if I want like little bits of white, I can do that at the end after that. So how do we get these darks darker? The first thing I'm going to do is I am going to clean up a little bit of the water off my palette, because as we get things darker, they have to have less water in them, or they won't, right? It's
It's not
diluting
really-
it. So folks are often, I think the concern about when you're painting wet into wet, you're like, oh, it's wet into wet. Everything should be really wet, but it isn't. It's actually quite dry. So as you can see, there's some water on my brush and there's some water in this mixture. And so, it's not like I'm doing nothing here, but I'm barely mixing water in. It's quite thick. Here I'm going to grab some of this Pearling green, which is a very almost black green. All right, I'm going to test it. So I can stay inside the shape of the darks. And now I'm kind of right, I've gone through the hourglass. So the darks aren't all one value. Of course, they're multiple values, but I can paint them wet into wet. So I have here a little synthetic brush that helps me control how much water I'm putting in. And I can come in here.
Is the paper still wet?
Yeah, totally. 100%. 100%. If I go like this, it just sits there, right? It's water tension. It's totally stuck. And if I like put my finger on it, it makes like a little blob, right? Oh, it's wet, wet, wet. Maybe even too wet, honestly. So this thing about wetting the back, I'm telling you guys, it's like changes the whole universe. Super valuable to me. Herman Peckel, I learned it from Herman Peckel, and I just thought that it was fantastic. This is amazing. I do think if you're going to do it, you have to be prepared for it to be messy. There's nothing particularly tidy about it. So, right? I have like a towel on the floor under where I paint.
Oh, I
Not
remember.
particularly tidy.
I should do that.
So by choosing a small synthetic,
Wait.
I don't know who's talking back there. Sorry. But by choosing a small synthetic, I get to not apply a lot of water to the subject. And so not only does my mixture thick, but also the brush does not carry much water in it, right? That is what helps me control. Move that window over. That's what helps me control the that's what helps me control the amount of water that I'm dropping in. So, okay, onwards and upwards. Let's go. So now I can do things though, like I can, kind of carve out those little stones. These are little stones that are actually submerged in the water.
Oh,
right? And they're just going to be little soft stones. And I don't have to. I don't have to have it be all perfectly hard edged. It's okay that it can communicate a soft edge. And this doesn't, of course, it works for a subject like this. A subject like this is it's underwater, but it also works just fine in like inside of a tree. Maybe you're going to do a bunch of foliage inside of a tree. Oh, that can really simplify a tree if it's in shadow. It doesn't have to make it so complex. Hey, Kate, Catherine,
Yes.
do you remember how to allow me to mute participants?
You click on their little box.
Yeah.
3 dots.
No, I need to be able to mute everybody. Right? It can be done, but I don't remember how to do it. This is what happens when you don't do a demo in half a year. I remember I could.
Participants down at the bottom.
Let's see. The only problem with that is then I can't hear them talk to me.
Well, you said
I did. All right.
That's how you do that.
All right, folks.
Then they can unmute themselves.
Okay. So thank you. What would we do without wives? So I have muted you all. Sorry. But now you can hear me, correct? If somebody, Dariel, can you wave your hand if you can hear me? Folks can hear me. Thank you very much. So you can hear me. If you want to ask me a question, just unmute yourself. You can do that still. And then I'll hear you. And then you can ask me your very important question, which is, right, I'm here. I'm really here to serve you guys. So, right, if you've got a question, sheesh, ask me, right? Like that's the whole reason that we're here, is to help share and for you guys to learn things. So what I'm doing now is I changed my hue. I have this dark blue gray, and this is wet into wet. It is this cast shadow of the stone, right? Where it's a little bit darker. And I can see a little bit here. I can see a little here. There we go. And away we go. So, right, I'm just carving out these little edges. Now I can paint. I need a tiny bit of water. I daub off my brush all the time. Now I can fill this area in. And I'm going to want an ever so slightly bigger brush because it's going to help me fill the shape a little bit faster, and it still has a really nifty point. Here I'm going around that big boulder. There's a big boulder here. And it actually bumps up against this other thing. So I'm actually going to shrink the boulder down. It bumps up against this guy in the middle, this bright fellow. Here's this. So, right, now I want to make sure we finish before it's ridiculously late. So I'm going to push us along a little bit. I'm grabbing some burnt sienna and a little bit of this dark mixture, because over here we have a dark value and I want it to be a little darker. And I use this bigger brush, but it's adding water. That's why this is creeping in. Now, as it slowly dries, I can do more and more detailed elements of the subject. Here, there's a little like a cast shadow on this little piece, and it makes it look a little bit like a stone. So I like that little bit. And if I want some of these little crevices to be extra dark, this is my opportunity to drop a few of them in. I like this one being blue though, but over here there's a fun crevice. So I'm going to grab this extra dark. See, over here it's dried. It's not connected to the rest of the material. But the rest of this is still damp. Damp over here. Not wet, 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 but it's damp. So I'm going to mix up some more green, ultramarine blue. I use a cobalt turquoise light, but it's a little too vibrant. So I'm going to grab ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and perylene green, and mix up a dark blue-green. I'm going to let myself kind of move along here. There's like little stones in here. And if I think, hey, this is getting dry, I don't want it that dry, I'm just going to pretend. I'm going to spritz it from like 2 feet away. And I don't know, like, well, I can already tell some of that landed in here and it's softening it already. So it definitely added just a little bit of life to it. But it's from far enough away and it's so delicate in terms of volume that I still get to preserve my hard edges. All right. I'm still trying to keep some of those whites from the surface, right? There's like little rocks and things. Okay, here is that fin from earlier. And the fin has a bit of a darkness on each side. And then in here, oops, clean off my brush because I'm going to change hues, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Because over here, it is it's the cast shadow of one of the rocks. There we go. And up in here, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but just to say, up here, it's there are like little darks inside the darks, right? And little like using a very fine tip. There we go. So I can also do things like clean out my brush, use my clean water, daub it off, get it a little bit dry. Try and lift a little bit. And I'm gonna see if I can, right? Just for a little texture in the water. And over here, there are some dark browns. These are like the edges of these little stones. Here's one too. And for sure, the paper over here is not as wet, but it's definitely wet. Yes, definitely still wet. So when I come in here, here's this cast shadow. Yeah, it's not quite exactly like the Notan, but you can see this stone now here is appearing down here now, right? It's made its entrance in the play. And here we have a darker value cutting an edge around a dark value, but not quite as dark, right? Oops, I used green. I meant to use blue. And then we kind of come out of the shadows behind this particularly dark shadow area. Now we're back into the greens of the water. Here, there's like a little separation. And then here, it's quite pale. In the, comparatively, it's a middle value, this little area in here. So I'm going to preserve it and paint around it to make, this is all of this is inside of the darks. It's inside of the blacks. And I'm just kind of trucking along. Yeah, it's good. It's only 1:30. So I'm going to paint through into this little sunnier area over here. And I'm just attempting to create the illusion of these submerged rocks. And one of the funny parts about this little subject is that if you're not careful, my experience is that sometimes you think, boy, I'm really expressing what is in front of me in this photo. But what you're actually end up doing is having a subject that's really, really busy. And we don't have any hierarchy of importance, right? So we need to have some edges be soft and some edges be hard. Yes, right? Thus is the nature of comparative importance. And we need some values to be very dark and some values to be, you know, dark, but not super duper dark. So when we're painting wet into wet like this, it's a way to sort of, it's a way in which the Notan can help us simplify our shapes, and it can help us have a little entranceway into thinking about wet into wet shapes and what sections go together as whites and what sections really sort of step apart and are the darks. And yes, there's different values in the darks, but they do actually all kind of bond together. So what I'm doing now is I'm coming back in with very dark, and it's quite thick and gooey on my palette. And my brush is just a little baby Escoda Perla number 6. So it's like it's not even 1/4 of an inch thick. It's like 1/8 of an inch thick. It's not very big, right? And of course, if I was painting on a bigger paper, really big paper, I would use a bigger brush as my small brush, right? It's all about context. So for these little paintings, yeah, this is a great brush. It does the job very well. So I'm dropping in now really dark darks. I'm just going bit by bit by bit, darker and darker, and thicker, and if I can, drier and drier, right? Darker, thicker, drier paint, and the farther along that I go. And that's helping me control the wet into wet work that I'm being guided through by the Notan. So the Notan is still guiding me, you know, very gently. Like, obviously this is not very complex and this is much more complex inside of it. But when I think about making a plan for the painting and how I'm going to approach it, oh yeah, right? For sure. Either I'm doing a Notan or I'm dividing my painting into my darks and my lights. And I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to drop in first? Then it's going to dry. What am I going to drop in second? What are going to be my darks? And I'm going to paint, you know, my darks bit by bit, darker and darker. But, you know, these are going to go in after my lights. There's that. And now I can come back into here. And this area over here is almost dry. Not quite dry, but almost dry. So I can come in and I can begin to try and carve out, right? Just the final little sections that are going to help me communicate different rocks in the water, different little shapes. Okay. So this phase is almost complete. Normally what I would do is I'll do this for us here too. I'm gonna dry it one more time, and I'm gonna drop in the darkest darks where I want a hard edge, and little highlights where I want to have a hard edge for highlights, right? They have to go on the top of everything else. So if I step back and I take this off, it should, is it going to equalize? Come on, little paper. Maybe if I take this off. There we go. So, right, now we can see the values of what I've got on this a little bit better for the pale values. Boop. And we can see here, right, what was the reference photo like and what is the Notan like, right? So if I was to have had if I was to like do an experiment, I could paint just the blacks in this Notan and it would still read. It would have all this complexity inside of the darks, but they're all, right? Those are all a much darker value than what's around them. And the Notan is what's helping me see. There's this stone. There's a little stone over here. It's not quite placed correctly, but meh, the world marches on. Okay. Now there is like little bits of texture also on this, and I do like to do little bits of texture. If you guys have seen me paint, you know I like to do spittle, actually spittle on the painting. You can also try it by using water on your brush. So like the surface of the water has a texture on it. So I can do little tiny spittle. And as it dries, we'll have little speckles. Sometimes you can take a brush and you can have water. I like this look. As it dries, I can do things like I can paint with water. And when I paint with water, it's very slow. It looks like nothing is happening. But later, it will, as it dries, it will equalize the water and it will spread and it'll push the pigment out, right? I can lift with clean water. Like there's a little edge of a stone here, a submerged stone. Maybe I want some variety of value. Here, there's like little bits. Here, there's little bits. So I'm just painting with these. We're going to see what they do as they dry. Okay. So I'm going to do that one is supposed to be paler, but it got eaten up by the black. So I'm making my brush be thirsty, and then I am lifting a bit of pigment and I'm putting in a different color, wet into wet. So I'm going to go and I'm going to dry this, and then I can come back in and I can do little highlights and little very, very dark things on this if I would like to. If I want to control my edges, that's got to be dry first for me to control my edges. But I could stop now. There's a certain type of artist that's like, sweet, this looks good, Steve, leave it alone, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. And I actually think most of us have a propensity to overstate the obvious in our paintings rather than actually understating it. Understatement is usually not what most of us are doing. Most of us are overstating the obvious. You lose some of the nuance and magic. And what you have is sort of like, you're like pointing the whole time. Look at some sort of details that you're including. So I'm going to hit the mute button again, and I'll be back in just a minute. All right. So it is starting to curl up on the edges, but if I pick the paper up, still has some water tension in it, right? So it's not actually all the way dry yet. It embeds deeply. At this phase of the painting process, right, I'm thinking about the shapes of the Notan, this interesting arrangement of this very complex black versus this very complex white shape, how they interlock. And I am looking at the hue arrangement, the story of the hues in the photo, right? So for me, this is the stage where you can do little fix-it-ups. What does that mean for me? It means things like, if I want to make this a little bit warmer, this is the stage to do it. If I want, I can glaze still, right? None of us are, well, some painters are pretty damn close to perfect, but that's not me. So I can make things a little darker if I want, and I can do a quick glaze over things. If I do that, I got to dry it again if I want to put on, say, little speckles or something like that. So as an example, I think, this is not quite warm enough. So I'm going to put a quick wash over some of this in an effort to make it, I guess, it's kind of got a sunny quality to it in the photo, and I like that memory of that sunny day. And I feel like the warmer that I can get these greens, the better, basically. I feel like the greens are a little cool, they're a little too blue, and I want it to be a little bit warmer. So I also want it to be a little bit darker. Not a lot darker, but a little bit. So this is a very simple way to do two things with one stone, right? So I'm using either burnt sienna, which is what I have over here, and it's a wash, right? It is not a very thick application of burnt sienna. Or I have a little bit of my green, and then I'm going to put a little bit of yellow in it. I'm just warming it up, right? When I was down at the Yuba River and I took this photo, part of what I really liked about the experience was how really green in a nice, healthy way the water was. It's quite interesting to me. And of course, the shallower it gets, the sort of less chromatic, less vibrant the green is, the darker it gets. More in shadow it is, the more vibrant and deep the greens are. That's part of what it was doing, right? So I'm just dropping in some of these on top of the value structure that I made. The other thing that I felt when I was looking at this a little bit as it was drying, right? When things dry, when watercolors dry, they tend to get paler, right? And I think most of us know that. They also tend to be less vibrant. So if I want a little more play about hue, then this is the opportunity that I have to sort of exaggerate some of that. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard before from a teacher where they'll say, if it looks right when it's wet, then it's wrong. I've been taught that, and it's often, that's true. That's the short of it. I think, yeah, it's looking pretty good. Well, it should kind of almost look a little bit too vibrant, a little bit too vibrant when it's wet. And then because it's going to dampen. Not only will the value structure lighten, but also the hues will knock off. They won't be as rich as they were before. So this is looking a little bit more like what I liked. I also felt like the value contrast wasn't quite as strong as I wanted it to be. So I'm actually punching it up just a little. felt like I liked these really dark darks, both in the reference photo and in the Notan. There's actually curves there. There we go. By bringing this all the way over, it helps me see the edge of the stone. Like the stone appears when I have the shadow line coming and dying out around its edge. Okay. And this is getting pretty close to done. All right. I admit, I suppose it's done enough for a demo, but even demos are little paintings. And I think it's a pleasure to make something that is what you consider beautiful. So even for a demo, I like to sort of finesse the details a little bit as much as I can. All right, I want to dry this because I do actually want to drop a few highlights in just to go over what it's like to drop highlights in and why I do that and how it relates to the Notan. So it's only 1:45. This will take about a minute for me to dry it. We'll go to 2. I can answer any questions you guys have, and we'll finish this version of the painting. All right. So I need my white. Where's my white? Where is my white? Just a moment. Hey, there's my white. Okay. So when we're thinking about the Notan, where did I put my Notan? Pardon me. I don't know what I did with it. Well, the show must go on. When I'm thinking about my Notan, I'm like, where did it go? I have no idea. I'll use the original. When we're making a Notan, I'm often telling folks to come in at the end, and if you need to drop in little highlights, that you should do so, right? Like that's part of the relationship of shapes and the relationship of value contrasts inside of your pattern, right? Your arrangement of patterns. So, and I think the same should really happen in your painting. These are hard things to preserve. So I'm totally 100% A-okay with dropping in highlights if I need to. And I feel like one of the reasons that this is particularly important in this subject is that the experience of the surface of the water is important. It's part of the story, not just the abstract story, but of the shapes, but actually it's part of like, oh, I'm looking at a water scene. So I do find—
Is that gouache or watercolor?
This happens to be gouache. In the past, I used watercolor. I actually don't think that the whites are particularly different, but this is gouache. This is titanium white gouache.
Is it zinc or, thank you.
No, titanium white, which I like titanium white better. I find it a little more opaque, and It's a bit blue, not always so great, but I really like that it's opaque. And if I want something warm, then I will mix it with yellow. A tiny, 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 tiny bit of yellow on the palette, right? So this phase at the end, you know, it needs to be goopy when you're applying it. I don't mix it up on the palette and add water to it. When I do something like that, it really becomes a wash, and I need it to be opaque when I'm doing it. So it needs to be thick and come directly from the tube. The other thing it can do sometimes when you have these experiences around water is that water will like bow up and capture light at the edges of the shoreline. And so sometimes it can help us communicate the shape. Whoop, that's a little bit more than I wanted, but them's is the breaks. The shape of things. That's okay. Okay, just a little, right? I just want to show that it's water. So if I had darks and I wanted them to have like a hard edge, this would be the time when I would do it as well, right? I don't in this subject, but if I wanted to, this would be when I would do it. But we're still, all the same stuff from the beginning that we were talking about is still happening here, right? So I'm still talking about all of the whites going first. I just open it up, comes through the hourglass, and I'm thinking, okay, I did this Notan and I simplified it. Now what the hell do I do with it? Okay, I take my whites, I paint my whites. Part of my whites might actually be white. Part of my whites might have a bit of value, which is what I've done here. If you feel like, hey, there's actually a couple of hues or a couple of shapes and I want those shapes to separate, then you have to dry it and you got to do another application, right? The more edges you want to preserve, the more complicated you're going to make it. Is it bad? No, not necessarily. It depends on what you want to achieve, but that's what will be required. If we want to simplify it, then the fewer washes that we can do, the more we bond the shapes together, and the Notan guides us into that bonding process, right? So that we can start to paint more shapes connected, more shapes wet into wet. After all the whites dry, then I'm like, okay, it's time for my darks. And when I did this, what I did was middle values first, right? They're still preserved in here a little bit. And then darker darks on top of them, sometimes wet into wet, sometimes it dries a little bit, right? But these are all of this is still they're the blacks of the Notan. And the Notan is helping me understand how I want to paint wet into wet. That's one of the things that a Notan can do really well, because the Notan is already bonding shapes together for us, right? Which is what wet into wet does as well. And so after I do my darks, now I have a little roadmap, my lights, my darks, and then I could put my lights back on top if I want to add little bits of highlights, or I don't know. I had some very, dark thing I wanted to put on top. Sometimes I do grass blades and things. It depends on the subject. That would go on at the end, right? So I'm hoping that this is a little bit helpful for folks if you've been doing some Notans and you're trying to think about how can they help? What do they do? How do they help you do? They help you do a whole bunch of stuff before you paint. That's for sure. Everything about composition, about arranging shapes, about finding leading lines, about simplifying one element of it and making one element more complex so you can have them complement each other, about finding value contrasts and little things that pull your eye because they're surrounded by other values. All those things happen before you paint, and a Notan can help you do that really well. The other thing that a Notan can really help you do is it can help you get a roadmap for how you're going to paint when you go in and apply it, right? You're going to do your whites, then your darks. You can do your darks wet into wet, more so. and it can go from there. So there are a couple of things it does really, really well. And if you've done these, I'm glad to hear that, Thomas. If you've done some of the Notans and you're interested in trying to do some of the paintings from it, I'm hoping that this can help you approach some of those, right? This process, by the way, just to say, is the same process as something like this painting that I did the other week, right? I did all these pale values in the background, and I did this hill in the background, and I did this very pale value for the road, all in the initial wash, and they were all wet into wet. I just tilted the board and I slowly, gently tilted, and they all went wet into wet. Down we go. There were no whites to preserve in this. It was all very pale values, but these were all the whites of the paint of the Notan. And then you can quite clearly see what were my darks. But some of these darks are definitely darker, and some of the darks are a middle value, right? That's okay. And then at the end, when I want to find and capture lights again, oh yes, I scratched out these little highlights with my finger while this was still wet. And that was how I was able to get grass blades. And in the Notan, I have little grass blades in white, right? So this also follows the same pattern of how are we gonna build the painting based on the Notan, just to give you an idea. And even something like this, which I also did from a Notan, also follows the same pattern. In this version, I did these values in the background, and they did require multiple washes because I wanted to separate them. But they're all part of the pale value. So in this version, the pale value is quite complex. But then on top of it go the darks. After I'm like, boy, it's taking a couple washes to get these different things with the pale values. Yes, it did. And then, yeah, here's a dark right on top. And obviously, this is a big wet into wet dark, right? This is the black of the Notan, for sure. And even though this is a middle value, it's clearly darker than what's right behind it. So this was also a dark in my Notan, these little weeds, right? And then you can see in here, I scratched out little things for little grasses, and I left little highlights for like abstract bits of foliage that captured some light, right? So, and I'd scratch some of these out at the end. So it's the same process, right? Some are more sophisticated. This has a more sophisticated pale value, but, and actually in here, part of this pale value is yellow. So I actually did a whole wash that was all yellow, and then I dried it, and then I came in and did my pale value on top of that because I didn't have whites. I had yellows as my whites, my whitest whites. My paper white was yellow, if that makes any sense, right? So if you've got complex, you can have a complex multi-valued white of your Notan. Yes, you just do those first. And then when that's done, okay, now it's time for me to drop my darks on top. It can be done that way too. So if you've been following along, then you've in the from photo to final painting, then I have these up in the pinned or featured part of the group, my posts, and you'll see I take a photo. I try and remember to take a photo partway through when it's just my whites, my whites, right? The pale values. And then I take another photo at the end, and it's just my darks on top at the finished completed painting, right? So you should be able to see what this looked like before I added my darks, right? So you can kind of get inside of the process a little bit. So these are definitely, it's the same process. It is.
Where is that we're following along? Is that a class or somewhere else?
It's not a class. I'm just doing it for free, for funsies, I guess, because I'm that kind of weirdo. So on Facebook, I have a free group. It's called From Photo to Final Painting. If you search it up on Facebook, From Photo to Final Painting, you'll find it.
Thank you.
And you ask to join, and then I give approval. And then if you're in the group, the group, we did a Notan challenge. I share some of these and people can try painting them. I give feedback on stuff, and other people also provide feedback and support. Right now it's a little over 250 people. And so it's just a little community, right? I'm not charging for it, so my engagement is dependent on my free time, right? But when I'm able to be involved, I enjoy the opportunity. And it also, honestly, it provides me a little space to play and explore different ways to teach things and to find out how it helps folks. So it's been a value to me as a teacher, and as an artist, it gets me to paint just like everybody else. So you can go there and you'll see these kind of things I'm talking about. It's there. So, and it's free. So
Awesome, thanks.
you're welcome, you guys. We hit 2 o'clock, so I'm going to turn into a pumpkin and I'm going to head out. And I will upload this to YouTube. And then if you guys want to rewatch it, or if you have some element of it that might make sense on a review, then it'll be there for us.
Thank you, Stephen, as usual.
You're welcome.
It's a
And
great
I'm glad
presentation.
that I can
Thanks,
be of help
Stephen.
and that you guys are
Thank you.
interested. So have a good
Bye.
day. And I hope you guys had a happy Thanksgiving if you are Americans.
Yeah,
And
the same
I
to
will
you.
maybe see you in the Facebook group.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. See you later, Robley.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Stephen.
Been a pleasure, you guys.